the baseline generic definition or, you know, of yoga as a method, as a praxis, is probably best defined by Nyaya, the school of logicians in ancient India. There were many different schools and they wrote different sutras. We're familiar with the Yoga Sutras, but a sutra is just a style of writing. So there were Nyaya Sutras, the school of logicians, and their definition of yoga, which is echoed elsewhere, it's the bottom line. Everybody would agree with this. Buddhists, Jains, all the different traditions. Is yoga is that which takes us beyond suffering. The ultimate goal of yoga is to relieve humanity from suffering, just as with other traditions like medicine and so forth, other, you know, intellectual traditions, even in our modern day science and so forth. From the point of view from a benevolent point of view, those who are studying and researching and disseminating these systems, ultimately they're kind people. They see the suffering of humanity and they wish to free humanity from suffering. And of course, depending on your vision of what is suffering, well, and of course that depends on your vision of who is the self that is suffering. So depending on your understanding of who is the ultimate self that is suffering, then your solution to the problem of suffering is going to be a bodily based one with medicine, or a psychological based one with therapy, or in the case of the sages of ancient India, it's going to be a deeper level cause and therefore solution to suffering, which pertains to the deep level self. So generic definition of yoga is that which frees us from suffering. Now, from that sort of common denominator accepted by all moksha traditions, and moksha traditions is a tradition that actually seeks to escape from suffering, right? Moksha means to become free. So free from what? Well, free from suffering. So then, of course, the different schools have different metaphysics. Therefore, they have different understandings of what is the self. And so from that baseline definition, then everybody accepts that. But then they will refine that into more specific definitions of what yoga is based on the presuppositions of their school. So Patanjali, his definition of yoga then is again based on the metaphysics that there is a Purusha and that it is a completely potentially autonomous and completely distinct from Prakriti. And it is a monad of consciousness. A anu is an infinitesimally small expression of consciousness. Of course, the quality of consciousness may be infinite, but the Atman in the yoga and Sankhya traditions anyway, not like Advaita Vedanta, the Atman is a small monad of consciousness. And because it is absorbed in that which it is not, because it is absorbed in a particular body mind, which are the product of karma, which is caused by previous activity, then consciousness experience suffering, because suffering is actually not a state of consciousness, but a state of the body mind. When we suffer because the body is afflicted by illness, by injury, by old age, by death, or we suffer because the mind is experiencing desires, distresses, delusions, anxieties, fears. So these are states not of the Atman, they're states of the body mind. So since they're not and as long as the body mind, as long as consciousness is absorbed in the body mind, Patanjali is very clear about this. There's a beautiful discussion in the Yoga Sutra, starts in the 2nd chapter, verse 15, and goes right up until the 8 limbs of yoga. In fact, the reason we do the 8 limbs of yoga is based on this understanding of suffering. It's the only way to be free of suffering. So since suffering then is a state of body mind, and we can adjust that with medicine and therapy. We can be in states of less suffering compared to relative to others or relative to our own histories, but we can never be free of suffering as long as consciousness is absorbed in body mind. And that is the revelation that Patanjali provides in 2.15. It is the first noble truth of the Buddha, and it is shared by all the moksha traditions, sarvam dukkam, that suffering is ubiquitous as long as consciousness is absorbed in the body mind. So what is the solution then for Patanjali to the problem of suffering? And therefore, what is yoga for Patanjali is to extricate, remove consciousness from any absorption in not just the body, but the mind as well. And therefore, his definition of yoga is chitta vritti nirodha. Yoga is chitta vritti nirodha, that if we really want to be free of suffering 100%, not just relatively suffering less, not just a relative state of less suffering, but an absolute freedom from suffering, there's only one way to attain that, and that's to extricate, remove consciousness from its absorption in the body mind. And therefore, therefore the asanas are to train the body so that the body can sit in meditation without distracting the mind, so it can be still. In that way, it's kind of put out of the way. It's sort of eliminated in a sense. But the real work of yoga is mental, internal, and that is to chitta vritti nirodha. Tada drashtu sarupe vastanam. Then the seer can abide in its own nature, and that is the only place, the swarupa is the only place free of suffering. So to put all that together, reconnect it to your question, what is yoga? Bottom line, generic, everybody agrees. Yoga is to free one from suffering. Well, then the next question is, well, what is suffering and who is the self that is suffering? So therefore, then you have metaphysics, then you have the philosophies of the different schools that speak from their metaphysical points of view. In Patanjali point of view, body, mind, or prakriti, they're not the real self. The only way to be free of suffering is to be disconnected from body, mind, and that is nirodha. That is the that's pratyahara, that's dhyana, that's dharana, that's samadhi, and the other limbs of yoga which prepare us for that. And the ultimate then, grand finale, only solution to be free of suffering is swarupe vastanam, the consciousness to be absorbed in its own nature. Of course, Vedanta will then add that then your own nature is ananda, satchid ananda. Not only will you be free of suffering, but ananda, you will attain bliss. But that's Vedanta, it's not yoga. And I know I'm sort of going on a little bit at length, but it's an important question. And if I may add, other schools will add to that. Bhakti will say, well, it's all very well. Will agree with all of that. Bhakti will agree with that and say, yes, of course, you're Atman, you're not body, mind, but there's also a Paramatman, a Bhagavan, an Ishvara, Supreme Atman. And ultimately, it's true, you can be free of suffering from this Patanjalian method, but real happiness comes only with reconnecting with Bhagavan. And then again, you enter into a whole other universe of the different ways that the different Bhakti traditions understand what is that connection and what is it, who is Bhagavan, and so forth. But I think I've spoken enough.
No.